I saw some people making money on YouTube, and I wanted to go shoot guns and get the ammo paid for by a YouTube video.
What really happened to Demolition Ranch will surprise you. He built one of the biggest gun channels on the internet, turned a Texas backyard into a media empire worth millions, and then, at the peak of it all, he simply walked away. No scandal took him down. No lawsuit ended it. No advertiser boycott forced his hand. So why did Matt Carriker, the man behind Demolition Ranch, choose to shut down a channel with almost 12 million subscribers and over 2.5 billion views? The real answer is stranger, sadder, and more human than most people expect, and it has almost nothing to do with running out of ideas. To understand why he left, you first have to understand that Matt Carriker was never supposed to be a YouTuber at all. He grew up in the Texas Hill Country, the son of a veterinarian, in a household where medicine was the family business and animals were part of daily life. While other future internet stars were chasing fame, Matt was chasing a veterinary degree at Texas A&M. He wanted to heal animals for a living, not blow things up on camera. The channel that would eventually make him famous started almost as an afterthought, a place to post goofy videos with firearms while he was still in school, filming things like a shotgun blast into an old computer monitor just to see what would happen. There was no business plan. There was no long-term vision. There was just a curious guy with a camera and a question he couldn't stop asking. What happens if we try this? What makes Matt's story different from almost every other creator who built an empire on YouTube is that he actually finished the thing he started before the channel. When Demolition Ranch began pulling him away from his studies, he made a choice that most young creators today would never make. He stepped back from filming, went back to class, and finished veterinary school. He became a licensed vet before he became an internet star. That single decision ended up shaping everything that came after it, because it meant Matt never needed YouTube to survive. He had a profession. He had a skill nobody could take away from him. Whatever happened with the channel, he was never going to be empty-handed, and that quiet security is part of why he was eventually able to walk away from a business worth millions without blinking. Once he returned to the channel after graduating, something clicked. Demolition Ranch didn't feel like a tactical review show, and it didn't feel political. It felt like hanging out with a genuinely funny, slightly reckless friend who happened to have access to unusual firearms and an unlimited supply of curiosity. He would shoot targets nobody else thought to shoot, test equipment nobody else thought to test, and react to the results with the kind of unfiltered enthusiasm that made viewers feel like they were right there with him. That tone, more than any single video, is what separated him from the crowded world of gun channels that exploded online through the 2010s. He wasn't trying to be the most tactical guy in the room. He was trying to make people laugh and wonder, and that combination turned out to be incredibly powerful. As the channel grew, so did everything around it. Demolition Ranch stopped being just one show and became the center of an entire operation. There was Off the Ranch, which gave fans a window into his family, his property, and his life away from the firing line. There was Vet Ranch, which took the veterinary training he had fought to finish and turned it into something genuinely meaningful, funding surgeries and medical care for shelter animals that might otherwise never have gotten help. There was a merchandise and branding business that grew far past simple t-shirts. And eventually there was a massive Texas property, a resort-style ranch that became the physical backdrop for years of videos, family moments, and business ambitions. What started as one guy with a camera had become a company with staff, inventory, deadlines, and a level of overhead that never really stopped growing. It's worth pausing on Vet Ranch specifically, because it tells you something important about who Matt actually was underneath the loud persona. Demolition Ranch was chaos, noise, and destruction for entertainment. Vet Ranch was the opposite. It was quiet, careful, and often emotional, built around saving animals that had been given up on. Viewers who only knew him from explosions and gunfire were often surprised to see the same guy gently walking an injured dog through recovery, funding a surgery out of ad revenue, and treating the whole process with real tenderness. That contrast mattered because it showed that the destruction was never really the point. The point was curiosity and care, wrapped inside whatever format the channel called for that day. But building an empire like that comes at a cost that isn't always visible from the outside. Every new business is another thing that has to be maintained. Every successful video raises the bar for the next one. A creator who started out filming for fun on weekends eventually finds himself running a company that never stops needing attention, and the bigger it gets, the harder it becomes to slow down without everything underneath it feeling the impact. By the time Matt had been doing this for over a decade, Demolition Ranch wasn't a hobby anymore. It was infrastructure. And infrastructure has a way of quietly taking over a life if nobody ever stops to ask whether it's still worth the trade. Then, in March 2020, everything shifted. Matt's brother Mark died of cancer. It's the kind of loss that doesn't show up as a dramatic on-camera moment, but it changes the way a person experiences time. Losing a sibling means losing someone who knew you before any of the success, before the subscribers, before the brand deals, before any of it. It's the kind of grief that makes a person start counting years differently, start noticing how quickly children grow up, and start wondering whether the next decade should look the same as the last one. Matt never turned that loss into a storyline for the channel, but people close to the story have pointed to it as a turning point, a moment where family started to weigh more heavily against everything else competing for his time. While that quieter shift was happening in the background, the platform underneath Matt was also changing shape. YouTube's policies around firearm content had been tightening for years, and by the middle of 2024 the platform introduced new restrictions specifically targeting videos involving certain types of firearms, modifications, and accessories. For most creators, a policy update is a minor inconvenience. For a channel built almost entirely around real firearm experimentation, spanning hundreds of videos over more than a decade, it was a direct hit to reach, recommendations, and monetization. Content that used to circulate freely was suddenly harder to promote. New viewers were harder to reach. The platform that had helped build the empire in the first place no longer worked the same way it used to, and that shift added real pressure at a moment when Matt was already reassessing what mattered most. Then came the moment nobody could have predicted or prepared for. In July 2024, at a campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, a gunman attempted to assassinate former President Donald Trump. In the chaos and coverage that followed, images circulated showing that the shooter had been wearing a Demolition Ranch t-shirt. There was no evidence that Matt knew this individual, had any relationship with him, or bore any responsibility whatsoever for his actions. But in the online world, association doesn't need logic to spiral into a crisis. Within hours, Matt's name and brand were being mentioned in headlines about one of the most disturbing news stories of the year, entirely because of a shirt he never chose to put on anyone. He responded publicly, expressing shock and making clear he had no connection to the shooter and condemned the violence. But there's no version of that response that fully undoes the damage of being pulled into a story like that. It's the kind of moment that reveals how little control a creator actually has over what their brand comes to represent once it leaves their hands. It's worth being careful and fair here because this part of the story gets exaggerated online. Matt Carriker did not do anything wrong. He had no connection to the attacker. He didn't promote violence, and nothing about his content encouraged what happened that day. What actually happened is something both simpler and more unsettling. A stranger wore his merchandise during one of the most watched news events of the decade, and that single coincidence attached Matt's name to a tragedy he had absolutely nothing to do with. For a creator who had spent over a decade trying to keep his channel fun rather than political, safe rather than provocative, it was a brutal reminder that a logo can travel places its owner never intended. Taken together, these pressures started to stack on top of each other in a way that's easy to see in hindsight but was probably exhausting to live through in real time. A platform that had become harder to grow on. A brand that had just been dragged into a national tragedy through no fault of his own. A grief that had been quietly reshaping his sense of time since 2020. None of these alone would have ended Demolition Ranch. Plenty of creators face policy changes. Plenty face unfair online associations. Plenty carry grief while continuing to work. But when all three landed close together, they seemed to have pushed Matt toward a conversation with his wife, Meredith, about what the family actually wanted the next chapter of their life to look like. That conversation is really the heart of this story, more than any algorithm change or any headline. Matt and Meredith have 3 kids, and like every parent eventually realizes, those kids were not going to be young forever. The years when they still wanted their dad around, still wanted him at the ranch instead of on a shoot, still wanted ordinary time rather than film time, were passing whether or not the channel kept growing. Matt had already built the biggest version of what Demolition Ranch could become. More videos weren't going to make it bigger in any way that mattered anymore. More views weren't going to buy back the specific years his children were currently living through. At some point, the question stopped being about whether the channel could keep succeeding, and started being about whether continuing to succeed was actually worth what it was costing at home. On January 28, 2025, Matt posted a video with a simple, direct title. He was retiring from YouTube and he was selling the ranch. For anyone who had followed the channel for years, this hit differently than a typical creator hiatus. This wasn't someone saying he needed a short break and would be back with new content soon. He was putting the actual physical property up for sale, the same resort-style ranch that had been the backdrop for years of off-the-ranch content, listed for $15 million. That decision made the retirement feel permanent in a way that words alone never could have. He wasn't just stepping away from the camera. He was dismantling the entire stage the channel had been built on. In the video announcing all of this, Matt didn't sound bitter or burned out in the way creators often do when they quit after years of grinding. He described the channel as having surpassed every goal he'd ever had for it. He talked about wanting to slow down and actually look around at his life instead of constantly filming it. He admitted to feeling nervous and sad about walking away from something he'd built for over 14 years, but he was clear that his family came first, and that the choice, difficult as it was, felt right. That combination of gratitude and honesty is part of why the announcement landed the way it did. This wasn't a man who felt like YouTube had used him up. This was a man who felt like he'd gotten everything he possibly could out of it, and now wanted to spend his remaining energy somewhere else. The final videos on both Demolition Ranch and Off the Ranch gave longtime fans the send-off they'd been hoping for, loud, familiar, and full of the same chaotic energy that had defined the channel from the start. But there was an unmistakable weight underneath all of it, because everyone watching knew this was the actual end. For people who had followed Matt for over a decade, who had watched his kids grow up on camera, who had seen businesses launch and animals get rescued and property get built, the ending felt less like a channel shutting down and more like a friend moving away. Even fans who wanted more content understood the reasoning once they heard it laid out. That's rare in the world of online creators, where most exits are messy, forced, or shrouded in controversy. Matt's exit was different because it was honest, and because he chose to leave while people still genuinely cared. So what really happened to Demolition Ranch? The honest answer is that several pressures converged at once. A platform that had grown less friendly to the kind of content that built his audience in the first place. A brand that had been unfairly and painfully associated with a national tragedy it had nothing to do with. And underneath all of that, a quiet, years-long reckoning with grief and time that had been building since his brother's death in 2020. None of those factors alone fully explains the decision. Together, they point towards something simple and very human. Matt Carriker reached a point where more success stopped being the most valuable thing available to him, and more time with his children became worth more than anything the channel could still offer. What's genuinely surprising about this story isn't that a YouTube channel eventually ended. Channels end constantly, usually quietly, usually because the audience drifted away or the creator ran out of ideas or the platform simply moved on. What's surprising here is that Demolition Ranch didn't end that way at all. It ended at nearly 12 million subscribers with billions of views, with a devoted community still showing up for every upload, run by a person who had every reason to keep going and chose not to. He didn't wait for the numbers to force his hand. He looked at what he'd built, looked at what it was costing him, and decided the cost had finally become too high, even while the channel itself was still thriving. Not everything ended though, and that matters too. Vet Ranch, the channel built around Matt's actual veterinary training, never carried the same farewell tone as Demolition Ranch. The work of helping shelter animals recover, the part of his life tied directly to the profession he'd fought to finish before fame ever entered the picture, remained something he could continue on his own terms at his own pace, without the same relentless content demands. In a strange way, that's the clearest window into what this whole story was really about. Matt didn't walk away from everything. He walked away from the parts of his life that had grown too loud, too demanding, and too exposed to forces outside his control, and he held on to the parts that still felt like they meant something. Matt Carriker spent 14 years building one of the most recognizable channels on YouTube, and then he spent one honest conversation with his wife deciding it was time to let it go. He didn't lose Demolition Ranch. He simply reached the point where continuing to build it stopped being worth what it would cost him at home, and he had the clarity and the security of a life and a profession that existed before any of it, to actually walk away. What do you think? Did Matt make the right call stepping away from Demolition Ranch while it was still at its peak, or do you think he could have found a way to keep it going on a smaller scale? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed learning the real story behind one of YouTube's biggest exits, subscribe for more deep dives into what really happens behind the biggest names on the platform.